Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio. I'm William Bell, and with me is our illustrious co-host, Don Preston, from Ardmore, Oklahoma, that great town out there in Oklahoma. How you doing, man?
Oh, I'm doing absolutely great, William. Boy, today's been absolutely wonderful, wonderful weather. It's just been spectacular. You couldn't ask for anything better. So, beautiful time of the year.
Very good. It looks nice out here, too, even though we have some overcast skies and had some, of course, rain earlier in the week. But sunshine's out now, so things look like they're turning out to be pretty nice, and look forward to a beautiful day tomorrow.
Yeah, you'll get our nice weather here in a day or so. You know, William, this has been a really, really exciting week so far. We very often like to share with our listeners some of the things that are going on in our ministries around the world and what have you. And I know you and I were talking earlier in the day about some of the invitations that we've been receiving from India, from Ethiopia, from Africa, from different places around the world where covenant eschatology is just really, really exploding. And we sometimes hear from people here in the United States who are lamenting how few fellowships there are. And that is true, but things are changing. I commented to my wife at lunch right after you and I had spoken on the phone. We were just going over some of the really exciting things that's going on in the world, some of the seed that is being sown, that has been sown for the last 40 or so years. And I said, well, probably what's going to happen, I said, about the time that I die, everything's going to explode. I said, may not live to see it, but it's gratifying and so incredibly thrilling, nonetheless, to see what is happening right now in our day and in our time as compared when you and I very first began years and years ago in the late 80s, early 90s. What the things that are going on right now are really just mind-blowing when you compare them with the way things were back then. If we heard from someone back then that had begun to study, if we heard from someone once a month or whatever, we were just thrilled beyond words.
That's great.
Yeah, but now, every single day and many, many times a day, we hear from people literally all around the world who have discovered covenant eschatology, and they are being delivered, literally being delivered from the bondage of the dispensational world with all of its paranoia, with all of its fear-mongering. You know, just this week, William, I was reading the comments by one, he's what you'd call a traditional or a historical premillennialist. He claims not to be a date setter, and he's not. But then at the same time, he'll turn around and say, well, the end has got to be near. It's got to be near. Well, I want to read for our audience an email that I received just this morning. Yesterday morning. And I only read it this morning. I was trying to get caught up on my emails. And a little bit of a backstory. As you know, William, the rapture was supposed to be yesterday. This, quote, biblical numerologist, unquote, by the name of Scotty Clark, predicted that the rapture was supposed to be yesterday. Now, I don't know about you, but I hadn't heard a word from or about Scotty Clark today. And the rapture was supposed to be yesterday. So, could be he's gone. But I'm pretty sure he wasn't raptured. So, anyway, with that backstory, and the fact that, Fox News and other news outlets carried the story about the rapture was supposed to be yesterday, this very same man had made predictions in 2017 for September the 23rd, the end of the world, going to happen. Well, he recalculated, rethought, refigured, and said, no, it's going to be September 23rd, 2018. Well, it obviously did not happen. And believe it or not, William, I was actually criticized on Facebook yesterday afternoon for pointing out that the prediction had failed. I was told that I ought to just keep quiet. There's no need to point out that this man was a false prophet. I'm going, there's no need to point out that this man has made repeated false predictions, that this man is costing people fear and ruining their lives. I mean, I was really quite staggered by those comments on Facebook. But all of that said, yesterday evening is when this email came in. And I want to share this with our listeners because, well, there are many reasons, but I won't go over all of them. But we very often hear from people about why we spend so much time talking about eschatology. And this email is a really, really good example of why we spend our time talking about eschatology. I won't give you the gentleman's name. I will tell you this. He's from South Africa, and just over the last 4 days, I have been in contact with at least 3 different individuals from South Africa. One of them wants to begin to translate my books into Afrikaans language for distribution in South Africa because they're so excited about the message. So all of that as a lead-in, let me read. I'm not going to read everything the gentleman had to say. I'll leave his personal complimentary things by the wayside. No need to do that. But I will read, to me, is just so incredibly exciting. Quote, I have never been interested in eschatology, mainly because I find Revelation and other prophetic books incredibly difficult to understand. Added to that, I find the fragmented views and expositions of such so varied and contradictory that I had made a firm decision never to venture into that minefield of confusion. That's to say, until the 23rd of September, 2017, when my dad became so engrossed with one, quote, Scotty Clark, unquote, and his predictions of rapture and all the other related issues, as I've similarly been taught all of my life in my church. I feared for my children last year, as I had never taught them about eschatology, as I had no knowledge on the subject. So I hastily, and may I add, in a state of panic for being a Christian father who can't even guide his kids correctly, began doing emergency Google research on everything these YouTube evangelists were predicting for the world. Because of the massive resistance I had developed towards eschatology over the years, and my total disrespect for most prophecy teachers due to their inability to agree on anything, I asked the Holy Spirit fervently to send me the correct people whom He had gifted to teach eschatology correctly. My journey since September of 2017 was intentional in the inclusion of futurist dispensational approaches and the total exclusion of anything else, as I grew up in a typical futurist megachurch as represented by most of today's televangelists. I quickly moved from a pre-trib view to a post-trib view, but the infighting amongst the futurists opened the door for me to investigate other, quote, strange doctrines, unquote, such as preterism. I did not want to read any preterist material, as the preterist teachers warned very strongly against such heresy. Well, the Holy Spirit led me to read certain articles, which led to others, and in February 2018, I suddenly realized one day that I had been understanding the Bible completely wrong, especially with matters of eschatology. I have now made a firm decision and shifted my position to that of the preterist, and I'm leaning heavily towards full preterism or kingdom eschatology, as you prefer to call it. It makes scriptural sense thanks to your solid teaching. My first encounter was with a little book by Larry T. Smith, then Morrow, Gentry, Chilton, Curtis, etc. I'm not completely comfortable with Gentry, though. I discovered your teachings at the same time as I did the before-mentioned gentleman, but I gravitated towards the other guys as I cannot afford material in American dollars since I live in South Africa and our exchange rate is simply horrible. This brings me to my question. Do you have any material in electronic format that may be cheaper than hard copies? So we're going to provide those to him. And he says, I want to thank you sincerely for the enormous effort you have made to teach eschatology correctly and pray that you will continue to do so for many years. P.S. My dad was devastated when the rapture did not take place last year. But I've been sharing my discoveries with him, and he has also now adopted the preterist position and is newly in love with Jesus at his 82 years of age. So thank you. End of email. Boy, I tell you, emails like that, needless to say, are just so incredibly, incredibly gratifying and thrilling as we continue our ministries, as we work together to spread the news of fulfilled eschatology. When you hear of people like this that have literally been in bondage, who have lived in fear, who have just been utterly devastated by the continual failed predictions of the dispensational world, and to know that our ministries are helping free people from that type of bondage, it truly is thrilling, and it's so incredibly humbling to be a part of that type of work.
Yes, that was a pretty interesting and exciting letter. This gentleman describing his journey and showing that he was eagerly searching for an understanding and had gone through all of these resources and channels looking for it. And then because of his, earnest seeking, he was led to find your material and other material on the preterist view, and has now, made that full journey, or at least is, in the process of doing it. And it's good to hear about his father as well, who is doing that. So these stories that we get are just amazing. And to hear the relief, the jubilation, the exuberance that people have once they discover this and realize the freedom that it brings them to. We're hearing this from people who are in various movements like Hebrew Roots and other organizations where they are still dominated by teachings of the law and dispensationalism. Many of them doing things that it's almost hard for us to believe that they actually do because of their eschatological viewpoints and teaching. And when they discover this, I mean, it's like they really experience a freedom that some of us probably have not considered until, since the time that we, became Christians and understood what, freedom was about and what relief from, baggage was about. These people have been carrying this baggage around for years, all the way through their adult lives. So it's amazing to hear about these events.
Yeah, it truly is. And as I said, you and I started out in the late 80s. You started out a couple of years before me in open teaching and what have you. But I well remember, William, the early days when some of us would get together, Jack Scott, Larry Siegel, Max King. You and I would sit around there at Warren, Ohio, and talk about what does the future hold? What's going to happen, and how is covenant eschatology going to impact the world in the years to come? And so now we are, over the last few years especially, we have seen such a surge in interest. And on Facebook, we very often hear the opponents of covenant eschatology talk and say, "Oh, this movement is so tiny, it's not growing, it's about to disappear." And we've talked about this before, and we respond to them and say, "Well, okay, if we're so tiny, if we're dying out, why don't you just go away and leave us alone and let us die?" Why are you spending so much time trying to dispel and disprove a movement that, according to you, doesn't amount to over a few people anyway, and is dying out, dying on the vine? What's wrong with you that you would spend your time trying to kill something that's virtually already dead? You really, literally just have to laugh at the illogic, of someone. One of those very individuals was posting today and saying, well, this is nothing but Church of Christ preterism. And I pointed out, well, your illogic really knows no bounds. Do you not realize that the Church of Christ as the larger body rejects preterism as heresy, so it's not Church of Christ preterism? But I said, now that you've mentioned that, it is spreading like wildfire in the churches of Christ. And I just cataloged some of the things that are going on. I mean, there's an upcoming seminar in California that you and I and Holger will be speaking at, and Steve Baisden will be speaking at. Brent Bishop in the church that he preaches at is sponsoring that. There will be a debate in Michigan. You're going to be sponsoring a conference in October. Our Predators Pilgrim Weekend is in July. They just finished one in Indianapolis last week, I guess it was. So they're like 6 conferences just over a span of a few months. And William, you and I remember when there was only one Predators conference in all the world one time a year.
That's correct. And in addition to that, there's a debate coming up with Holger and Bill Lockwood in June. So there's something scheduled exactly right. Every month all the way through until October. And there will be will be other events. But in addition to that, there's a conference that is going on currently at the Southeast Tennessee School of Preaching, I believe it is, and where they are talking about the end time. I know there was a lecture today by Jared Jackson on the 80-70 teaching, and it was really, really sorry. I mean, it was just pitiful. But one thing they made a point to do, and that was to tell everybody, don't give them a platform, as if we don't have one. Don't give them a platform.
We've heard this.
Yeah, it was remarkable. Now, remember, this is the doctrine that the Memphis School of Preaching said they could pretty much destroy very easily.
In 15 minutes or less.
Exactly. And yet, they had their mock debates on it. When they had an opportunity to discuss it in the open, they refused to do so, went behind a closed door, and they have refused to sponsor a debate on it in the city of Memphis for the last 30-plus years. As a matter of fact, I sent a letter to the current director out there now, which is, what's his name? I can't think of his name at the moment. But at any rate, I haven't heard a word from him. He actually spoke on this same lecture as well. And he spoke on the lecture in South Haven. I'll tell you who he is because I got the book right here, and don't know why I can't think of his name. But what was his name? B.J. Clark. Yeah. And
that's right. I was blank as well.
Yeah, I couldn't think of his name, but that's who it was. So I haven't heard a word from him. Sent him a letter, asking if he wanted to have a discussion. And but that's what's going on. So they're saying, don't even let these guys have a platform. Just basically turn a cold shoulder to them. And if we don't say anything, I guess they feel we won't say anything. They tried that 30-something years ago, and it hasn't worked.
Well,
it
sounds...
People are popping up all over the place.
Yeah, I find it absolutely remarkable, William, and I know that you do as well, for a Church of Christ lectureship to say, don't give these guys a forum. Do not discuss with them. Do not talk about this with them. And William, you know very good and well, if we were dispensationalists, or if we were teaching once in grace, always in grace, or if we were teaching salvation by faith alone, and was challenging these brethren to debate us, they would be debating each other for the privilege of debating us.
Absolutely.
They would be fighting each other to see who would be the first to debate us. I mean, if we were coming up and saying we want to challenge B.J. Clark on the subject of instrumental music, he would say, you just step right up and I'll debate you any day of the week. You know they would. But when it comes to covenant eschatology, kingdom eschatology, these men know they do not have answers for what the Bible says. And consequently, hey, don't you give these brethren a forum now. Just don't give them a chance. Some years back at the Harding lectureship, I did have the tape. I'm sure I've got it somewhere still in my files. A member of our congregation at the time, you'll remember him, Jim Conrad by name, he was present. And in the open forum, someone asked, what do we do about this AD 70 doctrine? It's spreading. It's going everywhere. It's in church after church after church. It's in our congregation. And the two men up on the platform failed to turn their microphone off. And you could hear them talking among themselves, saying, what do we say? How do we answer this? And they finally decided, and they finally said, brethren, whatever you do, ignore this doctrine. Don't discuss it. Don't let it be discussed. If it comes up in your church, squash it immediately. Do not give them the opportunity to talk about it, not in class. If it comes up in class, either ignore it or shut it down. And the conversation on the microphone, when they thought the mic was off, was more than a little revealing. It showed the utter panic on the part of those brethren. And I never thought that I would see the day, to be honest about it, being raised in the churches of Christ. My dad was a minister. I never thought that I would see the day in which I would witness such outright panic on the part of the leading ministers in the churches of Christ, absolutely refusing to discuss this issue. Some years back, when John Anderson, my good friend, was still alive, he challenged Alan Hires, who at the time was, and I guess he still is, I don't know, at the Get Well Church of Christ in Memphis. That was for years and years and years the bastion of defending the truth. And they still put out a publication entitled The Sword, Spiritual Sword. Yeah, and it's supposedly the key journal for the defense of the truth. And as you well know, Alan Hires, he was the editor of that magazine at the time. Don't know if he still is. But Alan Hires had numerous formal public debates. And John Anderson contacted him. He and I sent a formal letter of challenge inviting Alan Hires to come on to John Anderson's radio program. Now remember, John Anderson's radio program was a worldwide program, carried on stations literally around the world, and offered to have a debate with me on that radio program. And Alan Hires responded that he was not interested, and furthermore, no one was interested in eschatology. It would be an exercise in futility and of no more significance and of no more importance than debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. That was his terminology.
Now, that's very interesting because he showed up at my debate with Steve Wiggins in Memphis and actually tried to coach Steve in that debate.
Yes, indeed.
and one other thing. Jared Jackson mentioned you today. He said, my father, he said, Don Preston is one of the most prominent men who is advancing this view. And he might have mentioned your debate with David Hester, I'm not sure. But he said, and he wanted to debate my father. And my father, Wayne Jackson, kept refusing him, saying that he would not debate Don. And he said, Don went about boasting, I have asked Wayne Jackson for a debate, challenged him to a debate, and he refuses to debate me. And so his response was that he told you that he wouldn't debate you, but he would debate Max King. Now, first of all, that just destroys the idea that it was not important enough to debate. It was simply that he wanted to debate someone, I don't know what his thinking was, that just had more prominence at the time than you. But I don't know anybody in the... Go ahead.
That's precisely what he told me in letter after letter. He said, you are absolutely unknown. You don't matter. You don't count. You have no standing in the preterist community. Well, what I did when he told me that, like a second or third time, I contacted Max King, and I told him what Wayne Jackson had said. And Max King wrote me a very gracious, very complimentary letter stating that Don Preston was fully qualified and had Max King's 100% recommendation and commendation and support for debating Wayne Jackson. Therefore, Wayne Jackson had no excuse for saying that Don Preston had no credibility, because Max King himself said that Don Preston was plenty capable of debating Wayne Jackson. And, of course, Wayne Jackson still refused.
Yep, that's the story, and continues to this day. Can't get those guys to engage in a formal discussion. And now we've got new generations coming up, and they, in many cases, are less informed than the rest. The appeal that Jared Jackson was making was that, before you approach these guys, you got to really study this. You got to dig in deep. You got to really try to understand this, which means that they're not doing any teaching on it. They're not trying to examine the arguments at all, because they would have to just start a whole process of teaching. In many cases, I'm sure that's not 100%, because we know that there are some out there trying to deal with it, like Drew Leonard and a few others. But for the most part, none are really making any serious attempt. Certainly not as great an attempt as the one in trying to escape any opportunity to discuss it.
Well, perhaps I need to contact Garrett Jackson, the son of Wayne Jackson, and say, your father wouldn't debate me. You stated on the pulpit that I am one of the more prominent ones promoting it. So therefore that removes your father's objection to debating me. So how about you debating me?
Well, I actually sent a request to debate him both to his congregation, and I sent it, by way of a question to them on a site online. But I also had someone who was in the audience there to. I sent him a note to make the request as well, and I haven't heard anything. So we'll see if he answers either one of us. But go ahead and send it to him. Maybe he'll consider you worthy.
Send me the contact information, and I'll do that very thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, anyway, all of that's going on. It's just part of the many, many, many things that are going on around the world. Here we are. We're halfway through the program, but I very often hear from people who tell me that they appreciate us sharing this kind of news with what's going on in the world, so that they can kind of have a feel for the progress that's being made, to know that they're not alone, that there are other people out there who are just as excited as we are and as they are. And so we make no apologies for sharing this kind of information, and to let people know we make no apologies for what we are teaching, for what we are saying, and for what we believe. And that it is utterly amazing when you have men that have proclaimed themselves to be, or they have been proclaimed as, the champions of the faith, of the traditional views, and yet they get up on public platforms and they say, don't discuss this issue. Don't discuss it. Don't study it. Leave it alone. Because, if you're going to discuss it, brethren, boy, you better do some study first. Well, what a unique idea that would be, to actually dig into a subject that traditionally in the churches of Christ has not been dug into, except in almost a purely cursory manner. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed us sharing those things with you folks, because these really are important times. we're just hearing such wonderful, wonderful things. But back to the issue at hand. We've been discussing over the last few days or last few weeks the signs of the end, and we've been doing that because guess what? We have predictions like Mr. Clark, who predicted that the rapture was going to be yesterday, and we continually hear this kind of prediction. I mentioned a few moments ago this progressive dispensationalist or this historic premillennialist, and what I failed to mention earlier was that this individual said that any date setters are not respected within the true premillennial community. And of course, when they wrote that on Facebook, they were immediately criticized because the people who have been setting dates for years and years and years, Hal Lindsey, Jack Van Impe, and boy, it just went blank. What's the guy in San Antonio? That is
John Hagee.
John Hagee, yes. Harold Camping, who died a few years ago. Those were the leading voices in the dispensational world. Those were the men writing all the books. Those were the men selling all the books. So for this individual to write on Facebook that the dispensational world is embarrassed by date setting is really an amazing statement when the leading figures in the dispensational world have been setting dates all along. And he says they have no credibility. Well, they should not have credibility at all. But we have men such as Thomas Ice. Thomas Ice says no reputable dispensationalist would set dates. Well, his co-author of the book Charting the End Times, his co-author Tim LaHaye, in the 1970s was constantly setting dates. And Thomas Ice co-authored the book that entitled Charting the End Times, and stated that the generation that would see the restoration of Israel, i.e. in 1948, has to be the generation to see the coming of the Lord. Okay, so the generation that would see the restoration of Israel would see the coming of the Lord. The generation that saw the restoration of Israel was the generation that saw the restoration of Israel in 1948. Therefore, our generation, the generation that saw the restoration of Israel in 1948, has to be the generation to see the coming of the Lord. Well, guess what, folks? A generation is 40 years, biblically speaking. So let me see. 40 years added to 1948. Thomas Ice essentially set a date. Now, if you would pin him down on that, he said, well, you know, a generation could be more than 40 years. But that's not biblical. That is that old argumentum ad desperatum thing, that Latin term that I coined. And no, it's not a real Latin term, but it means an argument.
You make that statement in the Hester debate. I was listening to it today.
Well, I've had several people get a bang out of that. But it's an argument from desperation. I mean, it's just pure desperation. When the Bible sets a limit of a generation as 40 years, and you say that the generation that saw the restoration of Israel in 1948 will be the generation to see the coming of the Lord, you've locked yourself into 1988, folks. There's simply no way out of that. And let's give a little bit of latitude, okay? Let's say 10 years, because after all, 70, the measure of a man's life is 70, and if by measure of strength it be 80. Well, that's 80 years. Okay. 80 plus 1948, well, we've already passed that generation. And the Lord didn't come. The rapture didn't come. Great tribulation did not come. Abomination of desolation didn't come. The man of sin has not come. All of those predictions, folks, that have been made. And you know, William, a few years back, actually, after the passing of the 1948 year marker, I wrote an article. And then it was after that event, and then after the year 2000, and you will remember, I know, all the phantasmagoric predictions about what was going to happen in the year 2000. I mean, it's Y2K. This is it. The end is upon us. Even Gary North, the postmillennialist Gary North got caught up in that and predicted cataclysm for the year 2000. Well, the predictions for the year 2000 and the end was based upon the dispensational calculation of one day is with the Lord 1,000 years is as a day. And their argument went something like this. One day is with the Lord 1,000 years. Okay, it has been 6,000 years since the Lord created heaven and earth. The 7,000th year will begin in the year 2000. That's the millennium. Therefore, the millennium will begin. But before the millennium begins, there has to be the rapture. There has to be the man of sin. There has to be rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. There has to be the breaking of the covenant between the man of sin and Israel. They have to have the great tribulation, and they have to have the coming of the Lord to bring in the millennium. Therefore, Y2K, the year 2000, that's it. Everything's wrapped up. Well, once again, nothing happened. And so 1948 had passed. 1975 had passed, which our Jehovah's Witness friends had set the year 1975 as the year for the coming of the Lord. And then they set 78 and 79. You know, it just went on and on and on. But anyway, I wrote I wrote an article entitled The Loss of Argumentation. And I pointed out so many of these failed arguments that were continually made by the dispensationalists who just have told us year after year, generation after generation, this is it. This is the end. The signs are everywhere. And then, well, the end doesn't come. But you see, they made some predictions concerning 1948 and some predictions concerning 2000 that really locked them in a box for those people who pay any attention whatsoever. For the gentlemen like the email that I read for our audience at the beginning of the program. People that realize that we have a pattern of failure that just keeps repeating itself, and that there have got to be different answers. And so, like I said, I wrote that article chronicling so many of these failures and chronicling the fact that really, honestly and truly, time is running out for any of the dispensational arguments, of the so-called signs of the end. I mean, after all, if the restoration of Israel in 1948 was not the sign of the end, these guys are out of arguments. And, you know, Hal Lindsey went so far as to recalculate and to say that a generation is 125 years. Well, he has no justification for that. It's absolutely unbiblical. You have to go back to the flood days in order to get a generation to be 125 years. You have to go back to the days of Abraham. You don't go to the days of David and onward. You don't go to more modern times and get that calculation. So here we have these predictions, and in every scheme of millennialism and their schema, their narrative of the end times, the restoration of Israel is the foundational, pivotal, crucial element. I mean, after all, even the the progressive dispensationalist, man, they point at 1948 and says there is not any doubt whatsoever that was biblically and prophetically significant. Now, they're far more reluctant to set any kind of dates. They don't do even what Thomas Ice did and to say, oh, yeah, the generation to see that will be the generation of the end. No, the progressive dispensationalists don't do that. And yet they nonetheless point to 1948 as prophetically significant. Well, how can you point to 1948 as prophetically significant and ignore Jesus' statement, this generation will not pass until all of these things are fulfilled? And all of these things, guess what, has to do with the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection. So this loss of argumentation is a very, very serious thing. And what we are seeing is we are seeing less and less attention being paid to this, like men like this, pardon me, like Mr. Clark and his predictions. You know, he didn't get near the attention that Harold Camping did. He didn't get near the attention that some of these other false prophets have gotten down through the years. Remember, William, do you remember 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988?
Oh, yeah.
My goodness, how many millions of copies of that little tract were distributed and sold? And then, whoops, it didn't happen in 1988. And by the way, the person who wrote that tract was basing their prognostications and their calculations to a great extent on Mr. Hal Lindsey. And Hal Lindsey has been absolutely duplicitous, absolutely dishonest in his attempts to explain away his utter failure. And,
Don,
go ahead.
If we used his calculation of a generation being 125 years, and you take that to Matthew 1 and 17, where it talks about all of the generations from Abraham to Christ, Christ would not yet be born, if I calculated correctly.
That's a great point. That's a really great point. I had never thought about that before, William.
Well, I just did a moment ago.
Yeah. Well, again, it just shows how ridiculous these men truly are. Hal Lindsey, in order to get his 125 years, goes all the way back into the flood time. He doesn't go to Matthew chapter 1. He dare not go to Matthew chapter 1. Because he knows if he goes to Matthew chapter 1, that each generation there is 40 years. If he goes to Hebrews chapter 3, a generation is 40 years. So his original calculation, when he wrote his book, 1980s Countdown to Armageddon, when he wrote all of that stuff, he was at least a little more accurate in regard to the length of a generation. But since he was caught up in failure, caught up in false predictions, all of a sudden you had to do recalculation and say, oh, well, you know what? A generation really isn't what I claimed it was after all. Now, remember, he didn't admit any error whatsoever. He couched his explanation in terms of, well, some people have tried to say that a generation is 40 years. But when we look closer at Scripture, it's actually 125. Hal Lindsey didn't admit error, as I recall. He just simply said some people have said a generation is 40 years when it's actually 125. He tried to make himself look like the person correcting all of these false predictions, when in reality he was the chief false teacher. So again, what we've been trying to do, what we continue to do on this program, ladies and gentlemen, is to point out when Jesus said all of the signs would take place. And William, I'm reminded that just a week or so ago on Facebook, some discussion was taking place about Jesus' words. This generation shall by no means pass away until all of these things come to pass. And this one dispensationalist, oh my goodness, he was acerbic, he was caustic, he was hateful. He said, "You idiot preterist just simply don't understand the Bible. You fail to understand that what Jesus was truly saying there was the generation that will see all of these signs will not pass away until everything is fulfilled." And at least a couple of preterists said, well, you're exactly right. Jesus was saying the generation to see these signs will be the generation to see the end. And the point of fact is, as they pointed out very well, the signs did happen in Jesus' generation. Now, what none of them pointed out, what should have been pointed out, and I didn't have time to go ahead and post, this individual believed that the restoration of Israel was in fact the super sign of the end, just like Thomas Ice, just like Tim LaHaye wrote in their book, Charting the End Times. Now remember, they said 1948 was the, quote, super sign of the end, unquote. That's their own words. And they identified 1948 as that ultra, super duper, definitive, unrepeatable. As a matter of fact, one dispensational writer that I read, it's been a year or so ago, William, at least had the integrity to say, if the Lord does not come back very, very soon, in the lifetime of at least some of the people who witnessed the restoration of Israel in 1948. Well, see, that's not my generation. I was born the year after that. So that can't include me. But they were saying, if the Lord doesn't come back in the lifetime of at least a few of those individuals that witnessed the restoration of Israel in 1948, what that necessitates is another yet future dispersion of Israel into the foreign countries, and then at another later generation, another regathering. And that person was at least honest enough to say that does not seem likely or reasonable. Well, amen to that. I mean, how can you point at 1948 as the super sign of the end, and nothing happens in that generation, and not feel like a fatal blow has been dealt to your theology? How can you just wave your hand and say, oh, well, no big deal? No. You're the ones that said it's the super sign of the end. You're the ones that have said the generation that would see that will not pass until the Lord comes. That generation is gone. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, we have spent our time over these last few weeks, several weeks, pointing out to you that the signs that Jesus gave happened in Jesus' generation. Now, the restoration of Israel happened spiritually in Christ and through Christ. We don't have time on this evening's program to chronicle that, to document that, but I would simply say this. The passage that is used, Matthew 24, 32 and 33. Jesus said, when you see these things come to pass, then know that it is near, it is nigh, even at the door. For as the fig tree puts forth its leaves, and you know that summer is nigh, even so you, when you see these things, know that he is nigh, or it is nigh, even at the doors. So here's how the dispensationalists interpret that. They say, well, the fig tree there is Israel. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, in other words, when the fig tree of Israel is reborn, is restored, then know that the coming of the Lord is at hand. That's how they interpret that. Therefore, they come up with the view, the generation that would see the restoration of Israel, i.e., the fig tree putting forth its fig trees, would be the generation to see the coming of the Lord. That generation is virtually gone. And so, you see, they've got a problem. In Luke's account of Jesus telling that, Jesus says, when the fig tree puts forth its leaves, and all of the trees, then know that summer is nigh. Now, you don't ever hear or read dispensationalists going to that text. No, it's always about Matthew 24, 32, and 33. It's all about the singular fig tree. But you can't leave out Luke chapter 21, where Jesus says, when the fig tree and all of the trees put forth their leaves. Because you see, the fig tree puts forth its leaves at the same time as the other trees. Jesus was simply giving an illustration. Pardon me. He was not giving a parable. He was not giving a figurative statement about the restoration of Israel. He was saying, look what happens in nature. When you see that take place in nature, then you know that summer is nigh. Well, guess what? When you see the signs take place that I've just given, well, what were the signs? The giving of the Great Commission, the abomination of desolation, the Great Tribulation. Then know that the coming of the Lord is at hand. We have documented for you on this program, ladies and gentlemen, that each one of those signs, that the coming of Elijah, that the coming of the voice, that the coming of the messenger, that the Antichrist, every sign given by Jesus for a sign of the end occurred in his generation just as he said it would. And that meant the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection had to have occurred in Jesus' generation. William, it's really, really sad to me, and I know you share these sentiments, when people just, they rip these predictions, both old and new, completely out of their historical and prophetic chronological context, and they just apply them willy-nilly to any period of time, and most especially to their generation. It's because there seems to be a desire on the part of so many people to make themselves and their generation the most important generation that has ever lived. It's time to honor what the Bible truly says about the time of the end. And with that, we want to thank you for joining us right here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. We do appreciate you being with us so very, very much. Share the word, share the news. Lord willing, we'll see you again next week. So with that, I'll say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.